The snowstorm howled outside, its icy winds battering the wooden walls of Jack's remote mountain cabin. Inside, Jack, a retired firefighter, sat quietly in his living room, the flickering fire casting long shadows across the rustic space. The blizzard had shut him in for days, and aside from the occasional crackle of firewood, the silence had become deafening. Then came a sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A faint scratching at the front door. Jack frowned and set down his coffee mug. He paused, listening. There it was again. This time, the scratch was followed by a low, desperate whimper. His heart skipped a beat as he stood and moved cautiously toward the door. As Jack neared the glass window by the entrance, his breath caught in his throat. Standing just outside, half buried in snow, was a golden retriever. Her golden coat was matted with ice, her body trembling violently from the cold. Pressed tightly against her were two tiny puppies, barely visible beneath the arch of her protective stance. Frost clung to her fur, and each breath she exhaled fogged the window. Her eyes locked onto Jack's, wide, pleading, filled with exhaustion, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Jack stood frozen, hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew opening that door could mean inviting trouble. But something in her gaze stirred a deep, instinctive pull inside him. That look, it wasn't just fear. It was trust. A desperate, silent plea. The storm raged behind her, and the golden retriever didn't flinch. She stayed still, paws planted firmly in the snow, shielding her pups from the biting wind. Snow piled up around them, half burying the pups. Jack could see the outline of her ribs beneath her fur, her body painfully thin, her movements tight with tension. "What the hell happened to you?" Jack whispered to himself, his breath fogging up the inside of the glass. He hesitated only a second longer before reaching for the knob. The moment the door creaked open, a wall of icy wind roared inside, rattling the picture frames on the walls. Still, the golden retriever didn't move. She just stood there, watching him, as if unsure whether she should trust the man behind the door. "Come on, girl," Jack coaxed, crouching to make himself smaller, less threatening. "You'll freeze to death out there." She let out a soft whimper and glanced back at her pups. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward. Her movements were stiff, deliberate. She nudged one of the pups with her nose, urging it to move, but the tiny thing stumbled in the snow, too weak to walk. Without hesitation, the mother gently picked it up by the scruff and stepped through the doorway. The second pup followed, wobbling after her. As soon as they were all inside, Jack shut the door, muffling the sound of the storm. The warmth hit them like a wave. The retriever began to tremble more violently, her muscles spasming from the sudden shift in temperature. Jack moved quickly, grabbing an old blanket from the couch. Gently, he draped it over the mother and her pups. She flinched at first but didn't resist. When she realized he wasn't going to hurt her, she exhaled a long, shaky breath and lay down near the fire, curling around her little ones. Jack knelt beside her, his mind racing. The puppies were tiny, so small their eyes were barely open. Their fragile bodies shivered against the cold air, their tiny chests rising and falling with every labored breath. Jack reached out to touch one of them, but the mother growled softly, not threatening, just protective. Her eyes warned him not to get too close. All right, Jack murmured, lifting his hands in surrender. "You're a good mom. You've been through hell, haven't you?" He stood and went to the kitchen, returning with a bowl of warm water. Placing it gently near her, he backed away to give her space. She watched him warily for a moment, then leaned forward and began to lap at the water. Her pups huddled tightly against him, too weak to move much, but comforted by her warmth. Jack stood back, arms crossed, trying to process it all. Where had she come from? How had she ended up alone in a blizzard with two newborn pups? Her condition suggested she'd been fending for herself for a while, long enough to grow weak, but not long enough to give up. It was a miracle she had made it this far. Jack wasn't prepared for this. He hadn't had a pet in years. He'd always loved dogs, but after retiring from the fire department, he had settled into a quiet life, just him and the mountains. Still, looking at this golden retriever and her pups, something inside him shifted. "You've got a fighter's spirit," he said softly. "Guess that makes two of us." As the night wore on, Jack worked to make them more comfortable. He laid out towels for the pups, placed a bowl of kibble near the mother, leftovers from a stash he kept for emergencies, and kept stoking the fire to hold back the cold. The golden retriever watched him carefully, never letting her guard down. But slowly, as the hours passed and nothing bad happened, her posture softened. Her muscles relaxed. For the first time, she let her head rest on the blanket. Her eyes fluttered shut. Jack settled into his chair by the fireplace. The fire crackled beside him, and the only sounds were the occasional pop from the logs and the quiet breathing of the retriever and her pups. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing for sure: he had done the right thing. He looked at the mother and her pups again, and something like a promise formed in his mind. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I'm not gonna let anything happen to you." The next morning, Jack stirred to the soft sounds of tiny whimpers and the gentle crackling of embers. The fire had burned low during the night, its heat now just a warm glow across the cabin floor. He blinked against the sunlight filtering through the frost-kissed windows, his thoughts immediately returning to the unexpected guests resting by the hearth. He turned slowly, half expecting to find it had all been a dream. But there they were, the golden retriever, curled protectively around her two pups, their golden coats barely visible beneath the blanket. One of the puppies stirred, its small legs pushing against its sibling, trying to wriggle closer to its mother. The mother's ears twitched at Jack's movement, her amber eyes snapping open and looking onto him. There was still caution in her gaze, but the wild fear from the night before had dimmed. She looked tired, but no longer desperate. "Morning, girl," Jack said gently, stretching as he stood up and moved toward the kitchen. "Let's see if we can't find you something to eat." He rifled through his pantry, his shelves lined mostly with canned goods and dry staples. Finally, he grabbed a can of chicken soup, soft, warm, and hopefully easy on her stomach. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Jack heated it on the stove, letting the scent fill the cabin. The mother lifted her head and sniffed the air cautiously, her eyes following his every move. When he placed the bowl near her, she paused, giving him a long, deliberate look, before leaning forward to eat. The pups, sensing their mother's motion, let out soft cries and began squirming closer to her warmth. Their noses searched blindly, bumping into one another, until they found her side and latched on, nursing with tiny mouths and determined squeaks. Jack watched from a few feet away, quietly taking it all in. Despite everything, cold, exhaustion, starvation, the mother hadn't abandoned them. She had fought for them, carried them through the storm. That kind of strength, it hit Jack hard. "You deserve so much more than this," he whispered. He crouched nearby and studied her frame more closely now that daylight filled the cabin. Her ribs still jutted out beneath her fur. Her paws were cracked. She was a mess. But she was alive. And her pups were still here, thanks to her. Jack knew he couldn't just sit by and hope they'd recover on their own. He walked over to the old landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall. After a few rings, a warm voice answered. "Veterinary clinic, this is Diane." "Hey, this is Jack Carden. I'm out near Timber Ridge. I've got a golden retriever here. And 2 pups. They're not in good shape. Think you could take a look?" There was a pause. "Of course, Mr. Carden. We can squeeze you in this afternoon. Bring them over, we'll do what we can." "Thanks," he said with a breath of relief. "I appreciate it." He hung up and turned toward the dog, who was now gently licking her puppy's fur. He crouched down, lowering his voice. "You hear that, girl? We're gonna get you checked out. You're not alone anymore." Getting her into the truck was easier said than done. Jack found another blanket and slowly approached, crouching low. She tensed immediately, her body going rigid. As he reached out, she let out a soft growl, not angry, but nervous. Jack paused, keeping his movements slow. "It's okay," he said calmly. "I'm not gonna hurt them. Promise." After a few more minutes of quiet, gentle coaxing, she allowed him to slide the blanket under him. He bundled the pups close to her side and lifted them all gently into the back seat of his old pickup truck. He tucked another blanket around them, shielding them from the wind, then started the engine and began the careful drive into town. The roads were slick, the storm having only just passed. Snowbanks lined the shoulders, and the sun glinted off the icy surface. Jack drove slow, hands steady on the wheel, his mind a swirl of thoughts. Where had she come from? Had someone abandoned her? Or was she just lost, separated from her people during the storm? Whoever she had belonged to, they hadn't deserved her. By the time he pulled into the vet clinic parking lot, the mother had curled tighter around her pups, eyes barely open but still alert. Jack stepped out and walked quickly inside. The receptionist, Diane, looked up and smiled. "You must be Mr. Carter." He nodded. "Yeah." Then out in the truck. Within minutes, the vet and her assistant were at his truck with blankets and gentle hands. They moved swiftly but carefully, lifting the mother and her pups into a padded cart and wheeling them inside. Dr. Monroe, a tall woman in her late 40s with kind eyes, examined the golden retriever carefully. "She's severely underweight," she said, running her fingers gently along the dog's bony sides. "But she's got fight in her. These pups are lucky to have her." She turned to Jack. "Do you know where she came from?" Jack shook his head. "No idea. She just showed up at my cabin. I couldn't leave her out then." The vet smiled softly. "Well, she picked the right door." Later that afternoon, Jack brought them all home. The mother, now rehydrated and fed, was already looking a little stronger. The pups had eaten too, their little bellies slightly rounded. Jack carried them inside and watched as she settled down near the fire once again, her body now less tense, her breathing easier. She let him sit closer this time. When he reached out and gently brushed her head, she didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into the touch. "You're safe now," Jack said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what you went through, but you've got a place here. As long as you need it." That night, Grace, as Jack now found himself calling her, lay peacefully near the fire, her pups nestled against him. The cabin was quiet again, but the silence felt different. Warmer. More alive. And Jack, sitting in his old recliner, hands still resting on Grace's soft fur, realized something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, a new kind of life that Jack hadn't known he needed. Grace, as he continued to call her, was slowly coming back to life. Her fur, once tangled and crusted with ice, began to soften and shine again. Her ribs, once protruding like shadows under her skin, grew less visible with every meal. And her eyes, oh those eyes, they no longer held the weight of fear every time Jack moved. Snow and Ash, the names Jack had given the two pups, were growing stronger, too. Every day, they seemed to discover something new. Their first wobbly steps turned into playful tumbles. Their soft yips began to fill the once silent cabin with a kind of joyful chaos. Grace kept a watchful eye on them but began allowing Jack more and more into their little circle. Jack spent hours sitting on the floor beside them, letting Grace learn his presence wasn't a threat. At first, she would only glance at him, tense and alert, but gradually the walls between them began to thaw. She let him sit closer. Her brows quieted into a seasonal sighs. And finally, one morning, she let him gently scratch behind her ear without a hint of flinch. It was a small moment, but it felt enormous. That night, the wind howled again, rattling the windows. But this time, Jack wasn't alone in the dark. He sat on the floor, back against the couch, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. Grace was nearby, curled protectively around her pups, her head resting on her paws. Snow and Ash tumbled over each other clumsily, their tiny tails wagging like they had the energy of a dozen dogs. "You got some tough little ones then, Grace," Jack said softly, smiling at their antics. Grace lifted her head and looked at him. Her eyes were different now, less wary, more knowing. Jack reached out slowly and touched her head. This time, she didn't just allow it, she leaned into his touch. Something inside Jack shifted in that moment. He had opened his door out of instinct, maybe even guilt. But now it was more than that. He realized that this golden-haired stranger and her pups had brought something into his world that had been missing for years. A reason to tell it in. A reason to stay awake through the long nights. A reason to smile at the sunrise. As the weeks passed, Grace's transformation was undeniable. She played with her pups, nudging them gently with her nose, guiding them around the cabin like a patient teacher. Her energy returned in short bursts, her tail wagging as she moved with purpose. Jack even caught her playfully pouncing at Ash one afternoon, making the pup squeal in surprise and excitement. And Jack, he changed too. For years, he'd lived in that cabin with nothing but old photo frames and fading memories of firefighting days gone by. He thought he liked the solitude. Thought he preferred the quiet. But now the evenings were filled with the sound of little paws tapping on wooden floors, the soft grunts of sleeping pups, and the occasional deep sigh from Grace as she dozed in front of the fire. One afternoon, while chopping wood outside, Jack glanced at the window and saw Grace standing at the glass. Her nose was pressed against it, eyes watching him intently. Snow and Ash were nearby, tumbling over each other like balls of fluff. Jack paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and waved at him. To his surprise, Grace wagged her tail. Just once. But it was enough to make his heart leap. Still, the questions never fully left Jack's mind. Where had she come from? What had happened to her before she showed up at his door? And, perhaps the hardest one, had someone been looking for her? That night, he sat by the fire with Grace at his feet. The pups had already curled up and fallen asleep, their tiny bellies rising and falling in perfect rhythm. "I don't know your story, Pearl," he murmured. "But I can guess it wasn't easy." Grace turned her head slightly, ears twitching. "You didn't come to my door for nothing. You were trying to get them to safety. You were trying to survive." Jack ran his hand along her back slowly, thoughtfully. "I don't know what you've been through, but I know this much: you're home now." The next morning, with the snow starting to melt and the air turning crisp, Jack decided it was time for the little family to experience more than just the cabin. He opened the front door, letting the sunlight pour in. Grace stepped cautiously onto the porch, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. It had been weeks since she'd been outside without the threat of death behind her. Snow and Ash followed her, stumbling on their paws, yipping at every fluttering leaf and snowdrift. They slid across icy patches, chased each other in circles, and barked at sticks as if they were wild animals. Jack stood in the doorway, arms crossed, smiling. "You're safe now, Pearl," he said softly. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." But just as the moment felt perfect, Grace suddenly froze mid-step. Her nose lifted into the wind. Her body tensed. Jack noticed immediately. Her ears stood up, her muscles tightened. Her eyes focused on the trees just beyond the clearing. "What is it?" Jack asked, stepping forward. Grace didn't move. She just stared. Jack looked into the woods. Nothing. Just trees and snow and long shadows stretching across the white landscape. Still, he trusted her instincts. Let's go back inside. Once they were in, he locked the door and drew the curtain shut. Grace stayed near the window, pacing slowly, eyes still darting toward the tree line. That evening, Jack sat by the fire again, the warmth doing little to shake the unease in his chest. Grace rested nearby, her body curled protectively around her pups, but her ears perked at every sound. Every creak in the wood. Every gust of wind. Jack reached out and scratched behind her ear. "You're not just being paranoid, are you?" he murmured. "You've seen something, or someone." The next day, he drove into town. He brought a photo he had taken of Grace and the pups to the local shelter. At the front desk, a kind-faced woman named Sarah greeted him. "I found her outside my cabin," Jack explained. "Just wondering if anyone reported her missing, or if you recognize her." Sarah studied the photo carefully, then shook her head slowly. "No, I don't recognize her. But dogs like her?" She sighed. "We see too many of them. Some breeders out here keep dogs in awful conditions. When they're no longer useful, they're dumped." Jack felt his stomach turn. He looked down at the picture again. Grace's eyes, even in the photo, carried a haunting sadness. Back at home, as he let Grace and the pups out of the truck, she hesitated for a moment on the driveway. Then she sniffed the air and wagged her tail, just once. Snow and Ash bounded after her, their little legs working overtime to keep up. Jack watched them, anger and hope swirling inside him. "You're safe now," he said aloud, watching Grace. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Grace turned to look at him. Her amber eyes softened. And for the first time, Jack was sure, absolutely sure, that she understood. And in that moment, he made her a silent promise. Whoever had hurt her, they would never get the chance again. That night, Jack sat in his chair by the fireplace, slowly stroking Grace's soft fur. Snow and Ash dozed beside her, their tiny bodies curled into warm little balls. Outside, the moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light across the snow-covered yard. It should have been peaceful. But Jack couldn't relax. There was something lingering. Something that still didn't sit right with him. And then, he saw it. A shadow at the edge of the woods. He leaned forward, squinting through the frosted windowpane. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind playing tricks. It was a man. Tall. Still. Cloaked in darkness. Watching. Jack's pulse quickened. "Grace," he whispered. The golden retriever's head lifted instantly, her ears alert, her body tense. Jack reached for the phone, his hand trembling as he dialed the local sheriff's office. "Yeah, this is Jack Carter out near Timber Ridge. There's someone watching my property. I don't know who it is, but it doesn't feel right." The dispatcher promised to send someone out. Minutes crawled by like hours. Grace stood at the door now, her brows low and steady. Jack paced the living room, rifle propped against the wall within reach. His eyes never left the window. Finally, headlights cut through the trees, and Jack exhaled a shaky breath. Deputy Miller stepped out of her patrol car, a tall, sharp-eyed woman with a presence that calmed Jack immediately. She scanned the area with her flashlight, moving with quiet confidence. When she returned, her face was grim. "No one out there now," she said. "But I found tracks. Leading up to the tree line, stopping just before your yard." Jack swallowed hard. "You think they were camping up there?" Miller nodded. "I found rope tied to one of the trees. Old, but recently used. My guess? Someone's been using the woods as a hideout." Jack's gut clenched. He looked down at Grace, who hadn't moved from the doorway. He crouched beside her, gently running a hand down her back. "Don't worry, girl," he whispered. "I won't let anyone hurt you or your pups." Grace let out a soft whine, her amber eyes meeting his. But this time, Jack saw something different in them. Not just fear, but recognition. She knew who had been out there. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Jack kept his rifle nearby, sitting in the open chair, eyes flicking toward the window every few minutes. Grace stayed close to him, her body pressed protectively between Jack and the pups, her breathing shallow and tense. Just before dawn, as Jack was reaching for a cup of coffee, Grace bolted to the front door. Her ears perked, her brow deep and rumbling from her chest. Jack froze. Then he grabbed the rifle, stepping toward the door cautiously. Through the frosted glass, he saw a shape approaching. A man. Mid-40s. Hooded jacket. Rope in one hand. A smirk on his face. He stopped just short of the porch. "That's my dog," the man said calmly, but with something menacing beneath his voice. "Been looking for him." Jack's blood turned to ice. "Your dog," he said incredulously. "She showed up half dead. With 2 starving pups. If she's yours, why the hell did she look like that?" The man's eyes narrowed. Inside, Grace had stepped into the doorway. Her body was rigid. Her teeth bared. A deep, feral growl rose from her chest, like something ancient and primal had awakened in her. The man flinched. "Grace, get back," Jack said, his voice thin. But she didn't move. She didn't need to. In that moment, Jack understood everything. This wasn't just a stranger. This was someone she had escaped from. Someone who had hurt her. Someone who had tried to break her. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. "You should leave. Now." The man looked between Jack and Grace, then took a slow step back. Sighing. "But this isn't over." He disappeared into the woods, the snow swallowing his footprints behind him. Jack locked the door and dropped to his knees beside Grace. She was still tense, her eyes on the door, but her body trembled now, not with fear, but release. "He's gone," Jack whispered. "You did good, girl. You kept us safe." She let out a shaky breath and finally relaxed into his hand. Snow and ash stirred, their tiny yips soft in the quiet cabin. Jack gently scooped them up and placed them beside their mother. Grace nuzzled them instinctively, wrapping her body around their small frames. Jack sat beside them, staring into the fire. What came next, he didn't know. But whatever it was, they'd face it together. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to calm. Grace continued to heal, physically, emotionally. Her trust in Jack deepened. And the pups grew stronger every day, exploring the cabin with excited curiosity, tumbling over each other like little golden tornadoes. One afternoon, Jack sat at the edge of the yard while Grace and the pups ran freely through the thinning snow. The trees that once felt ominous now looked like part of the backdrop of a new life. He still hadn't seen the man again. But Deputy Miller had increased patrols, and Jack made sure the property was secure. More than that, though, he made a promise. No one would ever hurt them again. One evening, Grace rested by the fire, her head in Jack's lap, while snow and ash curled up nearby. Jack ran his fingers gently through her fur, his eyes heavy with thought. Her journey, from a snow-covered doorstep to this moment of peace, was nothing short of incredible. Her resilience, her fierce protection of her pups, and the quiet trust she'd given him in return, it reminded Jack of something he had long forgotten. Hope. "You found me," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "And I didn't even know I was lost." Grace's tail thumped gently against the floor. That night, Jack sat by the window once more, watching the snow fall in soft flurries. Not in fear. Not in loneliness. But in peace. He had opened his door to a stranger and gained a family. And though they had faced shadows, both literal and from the past, Grace had shown him that even in the coldest storms, love has a way of finding its way inside.